A classic car is left behind at a workshop, shrouded in mystery. A briefcase full of money is found, hidden in the trunk. The mechanic panics, his heart racing at the discovery. When trying to return the money, dark secrets from the past come to light. Certainly, I'll translate the story into American English, change the names and locations to American equivalents, and maintain the original length. I'll translate until I reach the output limit, and then you can prompt me to continue. Here's the first part of the translation. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. On a hot summer afternoon in Chicago, Michael was cleaning his tools with his usual dedication at Smith's Auto Shop, the establishment he had inherited from his father and maintained with great pride in the Bridgeport neighborhood. Sweat trickled down his forehead as he methodically organized each wrench and pair of pliers, a ritual he repeated every day at dusk. The small ceiling fan spun lazily, barely alleviating the heat that was melting the asphalt outside. It was then that a pristine blue metallic 1975 Chevy Nova parked in front of the shop. From the car emerged an elegant man, wearing an Italian suit that completely clashed with the simple environment of the neighborhood. Michael felt his heart race. It had been 15 years since he had seen that face, but he would recognize it anywhere. It was Richard, his older brother. Time had been kind to Richard. His graying hair at the temples gave him a distinguished air, and his posture exuded the confidence of someone accustomed to frequenting the highest circles of society. His eyes, however, carried an uneasiness that Michael immediately recognized, the same expression he had seen on that fateful night when Richard abandoned the family. "Long time no see, little brother," said Richard, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Michael remained silent, his hands tightly gripping the greasy rag. The weight of 15 years of absence hung between them like a heavy cloud. "I need a favor," Richard continued, twirling the Nova's keys between his fingers. "This car, it belonged to our father. I found it at an auction last week. I thought you might be able to restore it." Michael observed the vehicle with new eyes. Now he recognized the small characteristic marks, the almost imperceptible dent in the rear bumper, the result of their father's disastrous attempt to teach Richard how to drive, the small faded sticker on the rear window, a memento from a family trip to the beach. Why now? Michael finally broke his silence, his voice laden with years of pent-up resentment. "After so much time, why come back with this car right now?" Richard adjusted his tie, a nervous gesture that Michael remembered well from childhood. "Things have changed, Michael. I've changed. There are matters from the past that need to be resolved." Before Michael could question further, Richard placed the keys on the tool bench and took a business card with embossed letterhead from his pocket. "My contact information is there. Make a detailed estimate for the restoration. Money is not an issue." "It never was it?" Michael responded bitterly. "At least not for you." Richard ignored the provocation. "There's something important in this car, Michael. Something that could change a lot of things. When you finish the restoration, let me know. And, please, be discreet." With those enigmatic words, Richard departed, leaving behind only the echo of his elegant footsteps and a whirlwind of emotions in Michael's chest. The mechanic stood there, contemplating the keys on the workbench while long-suppressed memories began to surface. That night, after closing the shop, Michael couldn't sleep. He spent hours looking at the Nova through the window of his small house behind the shop. The car seemed to hold secrets, like a Pandora's box on wheels. His intuition, developed over years of fixing cars and reading people, told him that there was much more to this story than his brother was telling. The next morning, upon opening the shop, Michael began a thorough inspection of the vehicle. Every bolt, every weld, every inch of the upholstery was examined with professional attention. It was when, while checking the trunk lining, his fingers found an irregularity in the structure. There was a hidden compartment, skillfully camouflaged, and inside it, a heavy, old brown leather briefcase. Michael sat on the floor of the shop with the briefcase in his lap, his heart pounding against his chest. 15 years of silence. And now this. He knew that whatever the contents of that briefcase, his life was about to change forever. With trembling hands, he prepared to open the golden clasp, while the ceiling fan continued its monotonous spin, a silent witness to this moment that would change everything. With shaking hands, Michael opened the briefcase. Inside, besides a considerable amount of cash, he found a folder full of documents yellowed by time. They were contracts, deeds, and, most importantly, detailed records of his father's old businesses, Smith Construction and Sons, which had mysteriously gone bankrupt 15 years ago. Among the papers, an old photo caught his attention. In it, his father smiled alongside Richard and Edward Morgan, the current president of the country's largest construction conglomerate. The date on the back indicated that the photo had been taken just a week before the family's construction company went bankrupt. The shop's bell rang, interrupting his thoughts. Michael quickly stowed the briefcase in his personal locker and went to answer. To his surprise, he found himself face to face with Helen Morgan, an elegant woman of about 35, whom he recognized from society columns as Edward Morgan's daughter. "Mr. Michael Smith?" she asked, her green eyes showing a mixture of anxiety and determination. "I need to talk about Richard." Michael led her to his small office in the back of the shop, where an old photo of him with his father and Richard still decorated the peeling wall. Helen observed the photograph for a few moments before sitting down. "Your brother is about to do something that could destroy many lives," she began, her restless hands adjusting the strap of her designer bag, "including his own." "Why are you telling me this?" Michael questioned, intrigued by this unexpected visit. "Because you're the only person who can stop him," Helen replied, leaning forward. "Richard and we were engaged for 6 months, until he discovered something about the past, about our fathers." Michael felt his stomach churn. The mention of the past made his mind return to the recently discovered documents in the briefcase. "2 weeks ago, Richard cancelled our engagement and started acting strangely," Helen continued. "He has been secretly meeting with former employees of your father's construction company, asking questions about contracts from 15 years ago." The mechanic thought about his brother's enigmatic behavior the day before. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the puzzle was still far from complete. "What exactly did Richard discover?" Michael asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Helen hesitated, lightly biting her lower lip. "I'm not sure, but it has something to do with the old partnership between our fathers. Richard found documents, papers my father thought were destroyed." Michael thought about the briefcase hidden in his locker. Were those the documents Helen was referring to? "My father has been unrecognizable since he learned Richard was investigating the past," she continued. "I've never seen him so disturbed. He's spent the last week in emergency meetings with the board and his lawyers." A heavy silence settled in the small office. Through the window, one could hear the familiar noise of tools and the movement in the shop, a contrast to the tension of the moment. "Why did Richard bring our father's car here?" Michael questioned, more to himself than to Helen. "That Nova?" Helen smiled sadly. "Richard bought it at a private auction 2 weeks ago, paid a fortune for it. He said it was the missing piece to complete his puzzle." Michael stood up and walked to the window, observing the car parked in the shop's yard. How many secrets did that vehicle still hold? "There's one more thing," Helen said, her voice trembling slightly. "Richard has scheduled a meeting with my father for tomorrow. He said he's going to expose everything he's discovered, regardless of the consequences." At that moment, Michael's cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Richard. "We need to talk. Tonight, at the usual place." The usual place. Michael knew exactly where it was. The city overlook, where he and Richard used to meet as teenagers to talk about their dreams and plans for the future. Plans that had shattered 15 years ago. Helen stood up, smoothing her impeccable dress. "Please, Michael, talk to your brother. Whatever he's planning, it won't end well for anyone." After Helen's departure, Michael returned to his locker and retrieved the briefcase. He began to meticulously examine each document, each note. As he read, his face paled. The revelations contained in those papers were much more serious than he could have imagined. The sun was beginning to set when Michael finally finished reading all the documents. Now he understood why Richard had chosen this moment to reappear. The truth about the bankruptcy of their father's construction company was there, documented in detail, and it was very different from the story everyone knew. The Chicago sky was painted in shades of orange as Michael climbed the winding road that led to the city overlook. His heart was racing, not just from the steep climb, but from the anxiety of the meeting that was about to happen. The leather briefcase, now known in its contents, weighed in his hands as if he were carrying the fate of his family. Upon reaching the top, He saw Richard's familiar silhouette silhouetted against the horizon of the metropolis. His older brother had his back turned, hands in the pockets of his impeccable suit, observing the city that stretched out below them. For a moment, Michael was transported to the past, to the countless times they had been here together, sharing dreams and confidences. "I found the briefcase," Richard said without turning around, his voice laden with contained emotion. Michael approached, stopping beside his brother. "I found it, and I read everything." Richard finally turned to face him, his eyes reflecting a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Then you know. You know what really happened to Dad's construction company?" "I know we were deceived," Michael replied, his voice trembling with contained anger. "That the bankruptcy was a farce orchestrated by Edward Morgan. But what I don't understand is why you waited 15 years to do something about it." Richard sighed deeply, running his hand through his graying hair. "Because I only discovered the truth recently, Michael. I was just as foolish as you." The city lights began to come on below them, creating an almost surreal backdrop for the conversation that was unfolding. "When the construction company went bankrupt," Richard began, "I believed Edward's lies. He convinced me that Dad had made risky investments, that the bankruptcy was inevitable. He offered me a job in his company, saying it was the only way to save something for our family." Michael felt a lump form in his throat. "And you accepted. You abandoned us." "I thought I was protecting you," Richard exclaimed, the anguish evident in his voice. "I thought that by staying close to Edward, I could ensure that you and Mom had some financial security. But it was all a lie." Richard then recounted how, over the years, he had gained Edward Morgan's trust, climbing the company hierarchy. Eventually, he became the magnate's right-hand man, with access to privileged information and confidential documents. "It was 2 months ago," Richard continued, "when I found the original contracts hidden in Edward's personal safe. I realized that the bankruptcy of our construction company had been meticulously planned. Edward forged documents, bribed inspectors, all to force Dad to sell the company for a pittance." Michael felt a wave of nausea as he heard the details of the betrayal. Why would he do that? Dad's construction company was successful, but it wasn't a threat to the Morgan empire. Richard smiled bitterly. "That wasn't about money, Michael. It was about power. Dad's company had won the bid for the largest urban revitalization project in the city's history, a project that Edward had coveted for years." The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together in Michael's mind. Their father's sudden disappearance shortly after the bankruptcy, the rapid rise of the Morgan company. It all made terrible sense now. "And what do you intend to do?" Michael asked, dreading the answer. "Justice," Richard replied, his eyes shining with determination. "Tomorrow I have a meeting with Edward and the company board. I'm going to expose everything, present the evidence. It's time for the truth to come out." Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. "Helen sought me out today. She's worried about you, about what might happen." The mention of Helen's name made Richard falter for the first time. "Helen? She doesn't deserve to be involved in this. I love her, Michael. But I can't build a future on lies and betrayals." The cold wind of the Chicago night blew around them, carrying the distant sound of the city that never sleeps. Michael looked at his brother, seeing no longer the successful businessman, but the idealistic young man who had once dreamed of building a better world alongside their father. "What if there's another way?" Michael suggested, his mind working quickly. "A way to do justice without destroying everything in the process?" Richard looked at his brother curiously. "What do you have in mind?" Michael took a deep breath, knowing that his next words could change the course of their lives forever. "I think it's time we rebuilt Dad's legacy, together. But we need to be smarter than Edward. We need a plan." The two brothers stared at each other for a long moment, years of resentment and distance beginning to dissipate in the face of the possibility of a common goal. Finally, Richard extended his hand to Michael. "Together, then," he said, a genuine smile illuminating his face for the first time in years. Michael shook his brother's hand, feeling the weight of responsibility and the emotion of reconciliation. Together. As they descended from the overlook, the Smith brothers began to sketch out the first outlines of an audacious plan. A plan that would not only expose the truth about the past, but could redefine the future of the entire city. The night was advancing, and with it the beginning of a new journey for Michael and Richard. a journey of redemption, justice, and above all, of rebuilding family ties that had been broken for so long. The next morning, Smith's auto shop was buzzing with a different energy. Michael, who would normally be working on some engine with greasy hands, was sitting in his small office, poring over a pile of documents. The blue metallic Nova remained untouched in the center of the shop, a silent symbol of the turnaround their lives had taken. Richard arrived shortly after 9, bringing with him a folder full of files and a determined countenance. The brothers had spent a good part of the night discussing strategies, but there was still much to be decided. "I managed to postpone the meeting with Edward," Richard announced, sitting across from Michael. "I said I needed more time to finalize my presentation. I bought us a few days." Michael nodded, running his hand through his hair, now graying at the temples. "Good. We are going to need every minute. I have some ideas, but first we need more information." It was at that moment that the shop's bell rang. Michael got up to answer, surprised to see Helen Morgan standing at the entrance, looking even more anxious than the day before. "Sorry to show up without warning," she said, her eyes scanning the environment until they rested on Richard. For a moment, the air was thick with tension. Michael broke the silence. "Come in, please. I think we have a lot to talk about." Helen hesitated for a moment before following Michael to the office. Upon seeing Richard, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "You didn't go to the meeting," she said, her voice a mixture of relief and concern. Richard stood up, visibly affected by Helen's presence. "I couldn't do it without thinking better about the consequences." Michael observed the interaction between the two, realizing that there was much more at stake than just business and revenge. There were hearts involved, and that complicated the situation even more. "Helen," Michael began, deciding to take the initiative, "how much do you know about your father's business?" The question caught Helen by surprise. She sat down, nervously adjusting her skirt. "I always knew there were secrets. Things my father refused to discuss, deals that were made behind closed doors." Richard and Michael exchanged significant looks. Helen continued, "In the last few days, since our engagement was called off, my father has been acting strangely. He's paranoid, making calls in the middle of the night, ordering old files to be destroyed. He knows we're about to expose the truth," Richard murmured, more to himself than to the others. Helen looked at him, confused. "What truth? What's going on, Richard?" It was Michael who answered, his voice calm but firm. "Helen, what we're about to tell you might change everything you believe about your father and the empire he built." In the hours that followed, the Smith brothers revealed to Helen the whole story. The forged bankruptcy of their father's construction company, Edward Morgan's maneuvers to appropriate the Great Revitalization Project, the years of lies and manipulation. Helen listened to everything in silence, her face going through a range of emotions: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally, a deep sadness. "I always knew my father was ruthless in business," she finally said, her voice trembling slightly. "But this is monstrous." Richard approached her, hesitant. "That's why I couldn't go through with our marriage, Helen. Not without you knowing the truth." Helen looked at him, her eyes watery. "And now what do you intend to do?" Michael leaned forward, his face serious. "We want justice, but not destruction. We believe there's a way to correct the mistakes of the past without necessarily ruining the company your father built." "How?" Helen asked, genuinely interested. Richard explained the plan that he and Michael had outlined during the night. It involved using the evidence they had, not to publicly expose Edward, but to force him into a renegotiation. The idea was to resurrect the old Smith Construction and Sons, with Michael and Richard at the helm, and form a partnership with the Morgan Company for the next big urban development project in the city. It would be a way for your father to repair the harm he did, without necessarily losing everything, Michael concluded. But for this to work, we'd need someone on the inside, someone who could help us navigate the internal politics of the company. Helen was silent for a few moments, processing everything she had heard. Finally, she looked up, a new determination shining in her eyes. "I'll do it," she said firmly. "I'll help you." Richard looked at her in surprise. "Helen, are you sure? This would mean going against your own father." She nodded, wiping away a solitary tear. "My father needs to face the consequences of his actions, but you're right. Completely destroying him wouldn't bring real justice. This might be the only chance to fix things. Michael smiled, feeling for the first time in years a real hope. Welcome to the team, Helen. The three spent the rest of the day refining their plan, with Helen providing valuable information about the internal structure of the company and Edward's weak points. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the shop, a sense of purpose and unity formed between them. As they prepared to leave, Helen stopped in front of the blue Nova. "This car," she said softly, "it represents much more than just memories, doesn't it?" Richard joined her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "It represents a second chance. For all of us." Michael observed the two, realizing that amidst all this plot of business and revenge, something else was blossoming. A chance for healing, not just for the family business, but for broken hearts and long-forgotten dreams. As he locked up the shop that night, Michael looked once more at the car. Tomorrow, he thought, they would begin the real restoration, not just of the car, but of his family's entire legacy. The following days were a frenzied mix of meticulous planning and cautious action. Michael's auto shop transformed into an impromptu headquarters, where the Smith brothers and Helen met daily to refine their strategy. Richard, utilizing his position in Edward Morgan's company, began discreetly collecting more evidence of the questionable practices that had been carried out over the years. Helen, in turn, used her privileged access as the magnate's daughter to map out alliances and weak points within the board of directors. Meanwhile, Michael focused on another crucial aspect of the plan, the resurrection of Smith Construction and Sons. He spent hours poring over his father's old contracts and projects, updating them and adapting them to the current market reality. On a particularly tense afternoon, the three were gathered in the small back room of the shop discussing the next steps. "Edward is getting increasingly paranoid," Helen reported, massaging her temples. "Last night I caught him burning documents in the Home Office. He knows something is about to happen." Richard nodded, concerned. "We need to act soon. The longer we wait, the more chances he has to destroy crucial evidence." Michael, who had been silent until then, finally spoke. "I think it's time we bring in one more ally to our side." Helen and Richard looked at him, intrigued. "Who?" asked Helen. "Jack Ferreira," answered Michael. "The old accountant from our father's construction company." Richard furrowed his brow, remembering. "Jack. But he disappeared right after the bankruptcy. No one's known his whereabouts for years." Michael smiled, a glimmer of triumph in his eyes. "I know where he is. In fact, I've always known." He then revealed that Jack, fearing for his life after discovering Edward Morgan's manipulations, had sought out Michael shortly after the construction company's bankruptcy. Michael had helped him hide in a small town in upstate New York, where the accountant had been living under a false name ever since. "Jack holds the key to unraveling all the fraudulent transactions," Michael explained. "With his testimony, we'll have a solid case against Edward." Helen, however, seemed hesitant. "But if we bring Jack back, won't we be putting him in danger?" "It's a risk," Michael admitted, "but I believe he'll want to do the right thing. Besides, with the evidence we have now, we can offer him protection." Richard agreed. "Michael's right. Jack could be the missing piece in our puzzle." Decided, they elaborated a plan to secretly contact and bring Jack back to Chicago. Michael would be in charge of this mission, while Richard and Helen would continue their work from inside Edward's company. In the days that followed, the tension was palpable. Richard walked on eggshells at the company, feigning normalcy while secretly copying files and recording compromising conversations. Helen, in turn, used her charm and intelligence to sound out other board members, seeking potential allies. Michael made the trip to New York, returning 3 days later with a visibly aged Jack Ferreira, but with eyes shining with determination. The old accountant brought with him a suitcase full of documents that he had hidden all these years, the final piece of the puzzle they needed. With Jack on board, the plan gained new momentum. His revelations filled in the gaps in the evidence they already possessed, creating an almost incontestable case against Edward Morgan. One night, as they were reviewing all the gathered documentation, Helen suddenly stood up, tears in her eyes. "I can't believe it," she murmured, her voice choked. "All these years. My whole life was built on lies." Richard approached her, hesitant. "Helen, you're not to blame for this. You were a victim too." She turned to him, her green eyes shining with a mixture of sadness and determination. "I know, and that's why I need to do this. Not just for what's right, but for myself, to reclaim my own truth." Michael observed the scene, feeling a wave of empathy. He understood well what it was like to have your life turned upside down by the revelation of long-buried secrets. "Tomorrow," said Michael, breaking the moment, "tomorrow we confront Edward." Everyone nodded, the gravity of the moment hanging over them. They knew that once initiated there would be no turning back. The fate of Smith Construction & Sons, Edward Morgan's company, and their own lives was about to be decided. As they prepared for the night, each lost in their own thoughts, the old blue Nova remained silent in the center of the shop. Its interior, now carefully restored by Michael, held not only memories of the past but also hopes for the future. Tomorrow, Michael thought as he closed the shop, would be the day they finally closed the most painful chapter of their lives and perhaps opened a new one, full of possibilities. With one last look at his father's car, Michael turned off the lights, leaving the shop shrouded in the darkness of the Chicago night, awaiting the dawn that would bring with it the moment of truth. The morning arrived with a dense fog hanging over Chicago, as if the city itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the events that were about to unfold. At Smith's auto shop, Michael, Richard, Helen, and Jack gathered one last time to review the plan. "Remember," said Michael, his voice laden with determination, "our goal is not to destroy, but to rebuild. We want justice, not revenge." Richard nodded, adjusting his tie. "Edward will be vulnerable today. The quarterly board meeting is the perfect moment to present our evidence." Helen, who had spent a sleepless night, looked pale but resolute. "I managed to convince some key board members to arrive earlier. They'll be present when we confront my father." Jack, the old accountant, firmly held his briefcase full of documents. "I'm ready to testify. After all these years, I can finally do the right thing." The group departed for the imposing headquarters of Morgan Enterprises. Michael and Jack followed in a separate car, planning to enter discreetly through the back, while Richard and Helen would arrive through the main entrance, maintaining appearances until the last moment. In the lobby of the 30th floor, where the board meeting room was located, the tension was palpable. Executives in expensive suits circulated, exchanging formal greetings and curious glances at Helen, who seemed unusually serious. At 9 a.m. sharp, the doors to the meeting room opened. Edward Morgan, a man in his 60s with graying hair and a penetrating gaze, entered, followed by his entourage of advisors. He frowned upon seeing his daughter already seated at the table, along with some board members who normally arrived at the last minute. "Helen," he greeted, his voice revealing slight surprise. "I didn't expect to see you here so early." "Good morning, Dad," Helen replied, maintaining her composure. "I thought it was important to be present from the start today." Edward cast a suspicious look at Richard, who remained standing near the window, apparently absorbed in his tablet. Something in the air made him uneasy, but he couldn't identify exactly what. When everyone was seated and Edward was preparing to start the meeting, the doors opened again. Michael entered, followed by Jack. The silence that followed was deafening. "What is the meaning of this?" Edward stood up, his face a mask of fury and confusion. "How did you—" "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Michael interrupted, his voice calm but firm, "I apologize for the intrusion, but the matter we bring couldn't wait any longer." Richard approached, positioning himself next to his brother. "Edward, I think it's time we had a long overdue conversation." The magnate looked around, his eyes landing on Helen, who was now standing next to Richard. Understanding and betrayal were etched on his face. "You—" he muttered to his daughter, incredulous. "I'm sorry, Dad," Helen said, her voice trembling slightly. "But the truth needs to come out." In the 2 hours that followed, the boardroom was the stage for shocking revelations. Michael and Richard, supported by Jack's documents and the evidence collected internally by Helen, meticulously exposed the scheme that led to the fraudulent bankruptcy of Smith Construction & Sons. Edward, initially combative, gradually lost his composure as the evidence accumulated. The board members watched in shock, many of them completely unaware of the extent of their CEO's manipulations. "This is absurd," Edward tried one last time, his voice hoarse. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Everything I did was for the good of the company, for the progress of this city. It was then that Jack, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "Mr. Morgan, I was there. I saw with my own eyes the alterations in the accounting books. I heard the threats made to Mr. Smith. You not only destroyed an honest company, but also lives." The silence that followed was heavy. Edward Morgan, the titan of business, seemed to have aged 10 years in a matter of minutes. Michael, seeing that the moment was crucial, stepped forward. "Our intention here is not to destroy what has been built, but to correct a great wrong. We propose a restructuring." Richard continued. "Smith Construction & Sons will be reactivated in partnership with Morgan Enterprises. Together, the two companies can lead the largest urban revitalization project this city has ever seen." The board members began to murmur among themselves, some seeming to seriously consider the proposal. Helen, with tears in her eyes but a firm voice, addressed her father. "It's a chance to do the right thing, Dad. To leave a legacy of redemption, not guilt." Edward Morgan looked at his daughter, then at the Smith brothers, and finally at the board members. He saw in their eyes that there was no more denying or escaping. Slowly, almost defeated, he nodded. "Very well," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Let's negotiate." The following hours were dedicated to intense discussions about the terms of the partnership, the restructuring of the company, and the due compensations. When they finally reached a preliminary agreement, the sun was already setting over Chicago, painting the sky in golden and red hues. As the lawyers finalized the documents, Michael found himself looking out the window, observing the city his father had loved so much. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Richard. "We did it," said the older brother, a tired but genuine smile on his face. Michael nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and expectation. "It's just the beginning," he replied. "We have a lot of work ahead of us." Helen joined them, her eyes red but shining with a new determination. "We're ready," she said, intertwining her fingers with Richard's. As the three observed the city, Michael thought about the old blue Nova waiting at the shop. That car, which had begun as a symbol of loss and betrayal, now represented something new: hope, redemption, and the promise of a better future. The day had been long and exhausting, but there, at that moment, Michael knew it had been worth it. The truth had finally come to light, and with it the chance to rebuild not just a company, but also the family ties that had been broken for so long. The weeks following the confrontation in the boardroom were a whirlwind of activity. The news of the merger between the resurrected Smith Construction & Sons and the Morgan Empire shook Chicago's real estate market. Journalists speculated, competitors trembled, and the entire city seemed to watch with a mixture of fascination and apprehension as events unfolded. Michael found himself at the epicenter of a transformation that went far beyond the simple merger of companies. The old Smith's auto shop, which for so many years had been his refuge and livelihood, now served as an improvised office for the reborn construction company. Architectural plans replaced mechanics' manuals, and the smell of fresh paint overlay the familiar aroma of oil and grease. On a particularly busy afternoon, Michael was bent over the model of the first major project of the new partnership, the revitalization of an old industrial neighborhood. The plan was ambitious, aiming to transform the degraded area into a modern complex of affordable housing, green spaces, and cultural venues. Richard entered the shop, carrying a stack of documents. His face showed signs of fatigue, but his eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "The last contracts were signed," he announced, placing the papers on the workbench. "Officially, Smith Construction & Sons is back in the game." Michael smiled, feeling a mixture of pride and nostalgia. "Dad would be proud," he said, running his hand over the model. "We're realizing his dream of building a better city." Helen arrived soon after, bringing coffee for everyone. In recent times, she had become a constant presence in the shop, balancing her role in her father's company with her growing involvement in the Smith projects. "How's Edward?" Michael asked, noticing Helen's thoughtful expression. She sighed, sitting down next to Richard. "Getting better, I think. The therapy is helping. He still has difficult days, but he's starting to see things from a different perspective." Edward Morgan's redemption process was complex. After the confrontation, he had agreed to temporarily step away from the company presidency, focusing on his personal recovery and on repairing the damage caused. It was an arduous path, but a necessary one. "And what about the social housing project?" Richard asked, changing the subject. "Did we get approval from the City Hall?" Michael nodded, a smile forming on his lips. "It came this morning. We can start construction next month." Helen clapped her hands, excited. "That's wonderful. Do you know what this means? Hundreds of families will have a decent home." The enthusiasm was contagious. For a moment, the three allowed themselves to savor the victory. It was more than a business success. It was the realization of a long-buried dream, a chance to make a real difference in people's lives. As they discussed the next steps, the familiar sound of an old engine interrupted the conversation. Through the shop window, they saw a blue metallic Nova park outside. From the car, Jack emerged, carrying a box. "I thought you'd like to see this," Jack said as he entered, placing the box on the table. "I found it in the back of my closet. These are your father's old projects, things he dreamed of building one day." Michael opened the box reverently. Inside were drawings, notes, and even some old photos. It was as if the past and future were meeting at that moment. "Look at this," said Helen, picking up one of the drawings. "It's a project for a community center. We could incorporate this into our revitalization plan." Richard examined another document. "And here, a rainwater harvesting system. Your father was ahead of his time, Michael." Michael felt a lump in his throat. He always said that building wasn't just about erecting buildings, but about creating communities. The four spent the next few hours immersed in John Smith's projects, the patriarch whose vision now had a new chance to materialize. Ideas flowed, plans were sketched, and a new vision for Chicago's future began to take shape. As evening fell, when Jack said goodbye and Helen and Richard were preparing to leave, Michael found himself alone in the shop. He walked over to the Nova, now fully restored, and ran his hand lovingly over the hood. "Thank you, Dad," he murmured, "for everything." At that moment, Michael understood that his father's true legacy wasn't in the architectural projects or business contracts. It was in the ideal of building something greater than oneself, of leaving the world a little better than he found it. As he closed the shop, Michael looked out at the city stretching beyond, its lights twinkling in the Chicago night. Tomorrow would be another day of hard work, challenges, and undoubtedly obstacles. But now, for the first time in many years, the future seemed bright and full of possibilities. Smith Construction & Sons wasn't just a reborn company, it was a restored legacy, a fulfilled promise, and above all, a second chance, not just for a family, but for an entire city. The months that followed were of intense work and adaptation for everyone involved in the new partnership between Smith Construction & Sons and the Morgan Group. The transition from a small auto repair shop to a large construction company brought challenges that Michael hadn't fully anticipated. On a Monday morning, Michael arrived early at the new company headquarters, a modern building in Chicago's financial heart. Upon entering his office, he found Richard already hunched over a pile of documents, a worried look on his face. "We have a problem," Richard said without preamble. "The Construction Workers' Union is threatening a strike. They claim our hiring practices aren't in line with new regulations." Michael felt a weight in his stomach. The last thing they needed now was a labor conflict. "But we've followed all the rules to the letter. What exactly are they questioning?" Before Richard could answer, Helen entered the room bringing more news. "I just came out of a meeting with the Urban Planning Committee. They're asking for significant changes to the community center project. They say the environmental impact needs to be reassessed." Michael took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. It was in these moments that he missed the simplicity of his old life as a mechanic, but he knew he couldn't back down now. "All right," he said, assuming a decisive posture. "Richard, schedule a meeting with the union leaders for this afternoon. I want to understand exactly what their concerns are. Helen, prepare a detailed report on the environmental measures we've already incorporated into the project. Let's show the committee that we're committed to sustainability." As his partners left to fulfill their tasks, Michael found himself alone in the office. His gaze wandered to a photograph on the wall. It was the old Smith's auto shop, with his father smiling next to the blue Nova. That image always reminded him of why they were doing all this. The following hours were a whirlwind of meetings, negotiations, and strategic planning. In the meeting with the union, Michael discovered that the problem was more about communication than actual practices. He managed to reach an agreement, promising greater transparency and the creation of a joint committee to oversee working conditions. The community center issue required more creativity. Helen presented an innovative proposal to integrate solar energy systems and rainwater harvesting, not only meeting environmental requirements but exceeding them. The Urban Planning Committee was impressed with the proactive approach. At the end of the day, exhausted but satisfied, Michael met again with Richard and Helen for a recap. "It was quite a day," Richard commented, loosening his tie. "But I think we came out stronger from these adversities," Helen agreed, a tired smile on her face. "It's amazing how each challenge forces us to innovate. That solution for the community center, we can apply it to all our future projects." Michael nodded, feeling a mix of pride and gratitude for his team. "You're right. Every obstacle is an opportunity for growth. But there's something we can't forget." He stood up and walked to the window, observing the city stretching below. All of this, the projects, the buildings, the agreements, means nothing if we lose sight of our main goal, improving the lives of people in this city. Richard and Helen joined him at the window, contemplating the Chicago skyline. "You know," said Michael after a moment of reflective silence, "sometimes I find myself wondering what Dad would say if he could see all this." Helen put a hand on his shoulder. "I'm sure he would be incredibly proud, Michael, not just of the company's success, but of the positive impact we're having." Richard agreed. "I remember something he always used to say, building is easy. The hard part is building with purpose. I think we're honoring that legacy." His brother's words touched Michael deeply. It was true, every challenge they faced, every obstacle overcome, brought them a little closer to that ideal their father had always advocated. That night, as he left the office, Michael made a small detour. He drove to the old Smith's auto shop, now closed but still his property. He parked in front and sat there for a few minutes, just observing the place where it all began. The old blue Nova was still there, covered by a tarp, kept like a precious relic. Michael smiled, remembering how that car had been the catalyst for this entire journey. As he drove home, Michael reflected on the day. The challenges were many, and he knew more would come. But now he was certain they were on the right path. Smith Construction & Sons wasn't just a business, it was a mission, a legacy, a way to build a better future. And with each brick laid, with each project completed, they were, brick by brick, transforming not just Chicago's landscape, but the lives of its inhabitants. It was hard work, but Michael knew it was worth every effort. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities, and they would be ready to face them, together, with the same determination and vision that had brought them this far. The clock was nearing midnight when Michael finally arrived home. The apartment, located in a modest building in the Lincoln Park neighborhood, was quiet and dark. As he turned on the lights, his eyes fell on a framed photograph on the bookshelf. Him, Richard, and their parents, all smiling in front of the old Smith's auto shop. The image made him smile, but also brought a pang of nostalgia. As he prepared a quick sandwich in the kitchen, the phone rang. It was his mother, Sarah. "Michael, son, I'm glad you answered." Her voice sounded worried. "You've been working too much. We hardly see each other anymore." Michael felt a wave of guilt. With all the recent events, he had neglected his weekly visits to his mother. "I'm sorry, Mom, things have been crazy at the company. I promise I'll visit you this weekend." "This Sunday is the anniversary of your father's passing," Sarah gently reminded him. "I thought we could go to the cemetery together." The mention of his father made Michael swallow hard. "Of course, Mom. I'll be there, I promise." After hanging up, Michael couldn't sleep. His thoughts oscillated between the challenges at the company and memories of his father. He decided to do something he hadn't done in a long time. He took out an old photo album and began to flip through it. The images told the story of his family. His father teaching him how to fix his first car, Richard at his college graduation in business administration, the four of them together at a Sunday barbecue. It was a narrative of love, hard work, and dreams. Some realized, others interrupted. On Sunday morning, Michael woke up early. He stopped at the florist and bought a bouquet of white carnations, his father's favorites. On the way to his mother's house, he called Richard. "Hey, are you going to the cemetery today?" he asked, hesitant. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I didn't know if I should go." Richard replied, his voice heavy with pent-up emotion. "Come," Michael said simply. "Mum would be happy to see us both there." When they arrived at the cemetery, Sarah was already there, accompanied by Helen. The unexpected presence of the young Morgan surprised Michael, but filled him with gratitude. The four remained silent in front of John Smith's grave. Michael observed his mother, noticing how she seemed more fragile, her hair now completely white. Richard, beside him, kept his eyes fixed on the headstone, his expression a mixture of regret and longing. It was Helen who broke the silence. "Mr. Smith," she began, her voice soft, "although I never had the chance to meet you, I feel like I'm part of your family now. I want you to know that your legacy lives on. Your sons are accomplishing amazing things, things that I'm sure would make you very proud." Helen's words seemed to open a floodgate of emotions. Sarah began to cry silently, and Richard put an arm around her, his own eyes watery. Michael felt a lump in his throat. "Dad," he said, his voice choked, "I know we made mistakes, that we lost our way for a while, but we're back on the right path now. We're building something important, something that goes beyond ourselves. I hope you're proud." Richard stepped forward, placing a hand on the headstone. "I'm sorry, Dad," he murmured, "for everything. I'm trying to make things right now. I hope it's not too late." Sarah looked at her two sons, a sad smile on her lips. "Your father always believed in both of you. He knew that in the end you would find your way back to each other and to what really matters." After leaving the cemetery, the four went to Sarah's house. There, over cups of coffee and old family stories, Michael felt something change. The remaining tensions, the unresolved grudges, seemed to finally begin to dissipate. Helen, observing the Smith brothers interact with their mother, commented quietly, "It's amazing how even after so much time and so many challenges, family bonds remain." Michael nodded, realizing the wisdom in her words. "You know, Helen, I think I understood something today. The company, the projects, all of that is important. But this," he gestured to his gathered family, "this is what really matters in the end." As night fell and everyone was preparing to leave, Sarah called her sons for a hug. "Your father would be so happy to see you two together again," she said, tears in her eyes. "Promise me you'll stay this way, supporting each other no matter what happens." Michael and Richard exchanged a meaningful look. "We promise, Mum," they said in unison. As he left his mother's house, Michael felt as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The challenges at the company would continue. The obstacles would still be there tomorrow. But now he knew he wasn't alone. He had his family, not just by blood, but also those he had chosen, like Helen, by his side. As he drove back home, Michael thought about his father and the legacy he had left. It wasn't just about building structures or making successful deals. It was about building relationships, strengthening bonds, creating something that would last beyond a lifetime. With this realization, Michael felt renewed, ready to face whatever the future might bring. Because now he knew that no matter the challenge, he had a solid foundation, his family, to support him. The weeks following the visit to the cemetery brought a new dynamic to Smith Construction and Sons. Michael, Richard, and Helen worked in harmony, facing daily challenges with renewed energy and purpose. The Industrial Neighborhood Revitalization Project was finally taking shape, with excavations already underway and the first structures beginning to emerge from the ground. However, on a rainy autumn Wednesday, a series of unexpected events put everything they had built to the test. The day began with Michael being awakened by an urgent call from Jack, the old accountant. "Michael, turn on the TV now, news channel." Still sleepy, Michael obeyed, only to be hit by an avalanche of alarming information. The headline screamed, "Corruption Scandal Shakes Construction Sector." The reporter detailed a federal investigation operation into a bribery scheme involving several construction companies in the city. Michael's heart raced when the name Morgan was mentioned. Although the report mainly referred to old business, prior to the partnership with the Smiths, it was enough to cast a shadow over the entire group. He barely had time to process the news when his cell phone rang again. It was Helen, her voice trembling with concern. "Michael, did you see the news? My father, he was taken in for questioning. The police are at the company headquarters now." "I'm on my way," Michael replied, already hurriedly getting dressed. "Call Richard. Ask him to meet us there." The journey to the office was a blur of police sirens and clustered reporters. Upon arrival, Michael found the building in an uproar. Employees whispered nervously, some reporters tried to force entry, and there were police cars parked in front. Richard arrived moments later, breathless and visibly disturbed. "This is a nightmare," he muttered. "All those old practices. I thought we'd left all that behind." The three met in the conference room, trying to understand the extent of the problem and devise an action plan. Helen, normally so composed, seemed on the verge of tears. What if they discover something about the forged bankruptcy of your construction company?" The question hung in the air, heavy as lead. Michael and Richard exchanged apprehensive looks. Although they had worked hard to correct the mistakes of the past, the ghost of that old scheme still haunted them. As if the situation couldn't get worse, Jack burst into the room carrying a stack of documents. "We have another problem," he announced, spreading papers on the table. "I just received this from the finance department. It looks like there was a serious error in the projections for the revitalization project. We're running a huge deficit." Michael felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. It was as if all his worst nightmares were materializing at once. The corruption scandal, the possibility of their own past coming to light, and now a financial crisis in the project that was supposed to be the flagship of the new company. It was Helen who broke the stunned silence. "We can't panic," she said, her voice gaining strength. "We need a plan." "Now," Michael nodded, forcing himself to focus. "Right, Richard, get in touch with our lawyers. We need to understand exactly what's happening with the investigation and how it might affect us. Helen, you know your father better than anyone. Try to talk to him, find out what he told the police. Jack, review every number in that financial report. I want to know how we got to this deficit and what our options are to correct it." As everyone left to fulfill their tasks, Michael found himself alone in the room, the weight of the world on his shoulders. His gaze wandered to the window, where the rain was battering the city. He remembered his father, how he faced adversities with calm and determination. "What would you do, Dad?" he murmured to himself. As if in response, his eyes fell on a framed phrase on the wall, words from his father that had become the motto of the new Smith Construction & Sons. "We build more than buildings. We build trust." At that moment, Michael knew what he needed to do. He picked up the phone and started making calls. To the Workers' Union, to members of the Urban Planning Committee, to journalists he knew. It was time to be transparent, to face the storm head-on. The following hours were a whirlwind of meetings, press statements, and tense negotiations. Michael, Richard, and Helen worked tirelessly, fighting not just to save the company, but to preserve the integrity of what they had built. As night fell, exhausted but determined, the three met again in the conference room. The scenario was grim, but not without hope. "The lawyers think we can legally distance ourselves from the old Morgan practices," Richard informed, "but it will require significant restructuring." Helen added, "I spoke with my father. He took responsibility for many things. He said he doesn't want his mistakes to harm us." Michael absorbed the information, his mind working quickly. "And what about the project deficit, Jack?" The accountant, who had just entered the room, seemed more optimistic. "We found a solution. It will require some cuts and renegotiations, but it's feasible. We can keep the project going." Michael looked at each of them, feeling a wave of gratitude and determination. "It won't be easy," he said, "but we'll overcome this, together." As they prepared for another long night of work, Michael felt a certainty growing inside him. This crisis, as difficult as it was also an opportunity. A chance to prove that the new Smith Construction & Sons was truly different, that they were committed to transparency and integrity. Outside, the storm continued, but inside that room, a new determination was forming. They would face each challenge, one at a time, and come out stronger on the other side. The night would be long, but the dawn would bring with it the promise of a new beginning. And Michael was ready to build that future, brick by brick, with the same dedication he had once applied to engines in his old auto shop. The days that followed the storm of revelations were a test of endurance for everyone at Smith Construction & Sons. Michael, Richard, and Helen barely left the office, working tirelessly to manage the crisis and keep the revitalization project on track. A week after the scandal broke, Michael called a press conference. The company lobby was packed with journalists, all eager for answers. Michael felt the weight of all eyes on him as he approached the microphone, Richard and Helen by his side. "Good morning, everyone," Michael began, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "We're here today to address the recent allegations and clarify our position. First, I want to make it clear that Smith Construction & Sons is committed to full transparency in this process." He paused, looking directly at the cameras. "Yes, there were mistakes in the past, mistakes we're not proud of and for which we take full responsibility. But what matters now is how we choose to move forward." Michael then detailed the measures they were taking: an independent audit of all contracts, the implementation of new compliance protocols, and a renewed commitment to ethical business practices. "More importantly," he continued, "we want to reaffirm our commitment to the city of Chicago and its citizens. The revitalization project will continue. In fact, we are redoubling our efforts to ensure that it not only continues, but exceeds the community's expectations." The questions that followed were difficult, sometimes hostile, but Michael, Richard, and Helen faced them with honesty and determination. By the end of the press conference, there was a palpable feeling that something had changed. The frankness and willingness to take responsibility seemed to have touched even the most skeptical journalists. In the days that followed, the team dove headfirst into work. Richard led the financial restructuring, cutting costs where possible and renegotiating contracts to keep the project viable. Helen used her contacts and diplomatic skills to calm nervous investors and reassure business partners. Michael, for his part, focused on the construction site. He spent entire days at the revitalization project location, talking with workers, listening to their concerns and ideas. His constant presence and willingness to get his hands dirty alongside the team did not go unnoticed. On a particularly hot afternoon, while Michael was helping unload a truck of materials, he was approached by Mrs. Johnson, an elderly lady who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. "Mr. Smith," she called out, approaching with a group of residents, "we came to see how the work is progressing." With all this confusion in the news, we were worried. Michael wiped the sweat from his forehead, looking at the group. He saw in their eyes a mixture of apprehension and hope. At that moment, he understood that what they were building was much more than a set of buildings. It was the future of an entire community. "Mrs. Johnson, folks," he began, inviting them for an impromptu tour of the construction site. "Let me show you exactly what we're doing here." For the next 2 hours, Michael guided the group through the site, explaining every aspect of the project, from the affordable housing units to the planned green areas and the community center. He was transparent about the challenges they faced, but also shared his vision for the neighborhood's future. At the end of the tour, Mrs. Johnson took Michael's hand in hers. "You know, Mr. Smith, when I first heard about this project, I thought it was just another empty promise, but now I see that you really care." Mrs. Johnson's words echoed in the days that followed. Michael shared them with the team, using them as a reminder of the true purpose of their work. Slowly, things began to improve. The independent audit, though rigorous, found no irregularities in Smith Construction & Sons' current projects. The press, initially hostile, began to report positively on the company's efforts to redeem itself and maintain its commitments to the community. One night, almost a month after the crisis began, Michael, Richard, and Helen gathered in the office for a recap. "Things are stabilizing," Richard reported, reviewing the latest financial reports. "We still have a long way to go, but we're on the right track." Helen nodded, a tired smile on her face. "The community's reaction has been incredible. That open house day at the construction site was a masterpiece, Michael." Michael smiled, remembering the event they had organized, inviting the community to see the work's progress and share their opinions. It had been a resounding success. "You know," said Michael, looking out the window at the city stretching below, "I think I finally understood what my dad meant by building trust. It's not something you do overnight. It's a constant process, brick by brick, just like we build a building." Richard put a hand on his brother's shoulder. "And we're doing it together. As a family," Helen joined them, forming a silent circle of mutual support. The three knew there would still be challenges ahead, but now they faced the future with renewed confidence. Outside, Chicago's lights shone against the night sky. a constant reminder of the impact their work would have on the lives of thousands of people. Smith Construction and Sons wasn't just rebuilding its reputation, it was helping to shape the future of an entire city. And for Michael, Richard, and Helen, there was no mission more important or gratifying than that. A year passed since the crisis that nearly destroyed everything they had fought for. The sun of a spring morning bathed Chicago when Michael arrived at the revitalization project site. What was once a construction site had now transformed into a vibrant, renewed neighborhood. Buildings with modern architecture, yet harmonious with the surroundings, rose where industrial ruins once stood. Green areas dotted the space between constructions, offering respite and life to the urban landscape. At the center of it all, an imposing community center housed a library, spaces for courses and workshops, and a health clinic. Michael walked slowly along the newly paved streets, observing the residents who already occupied the new homes. Children played in a safe playground, elderly people chatted on benches in the shade of young trees, and small local businesses were beginning to flourish. "It's amazing, isn't it?" said a familiar voice behind him. Michael turned to see Richard and Helen approaching, both with smiles on their faces. "Sometimes I still can't believe we did it," Michael replied, emotion evident in his voice. The three walked together, recalling the challenges faced and the victories won over the past year. The audit had been completed, resulting in a complete restructuring of business practices. Transparency and commitment to ethics had become the new standard, not just for Smith Construction and Sons, but for the entire construction sector in the city. As they reached the central square of the new neighborhood, they saw a crowd forming. It was the day of the project's official inauguration, and it seemed that the entire community was present to celebrate. Mrs. Johnson, now a beloved figure for the team, approached with a group of residents. "Mr. Michael, Mr. Richard, Miss Helen," she greeted warmly, "you kept your promise. This place, it's more than we could have dreamed of." Michael felt a lump in his throat. "Mrs. Johnson, it was you who made this possible. Your trust, your support, it meant everything to us." The inauguration ceremony was simple but moving. Michael, Richard, and Helen spoke briefly, but the real focus was on the residents who shared their stories and hopes for the neighborhood's future. When the commemorative plaque was revealed, Michael felt his heart leap. There, engraved in golden letters, was the name John Smith Housing Complex. "Surprise," whispered Helen, smiling at the Smith brothers. "We thought it would be the perfect tribute." Michael and Richard exchanged emotional looks, unable to speak. Their father's legacy was alive not just in the name of the complex, but in the spirit of community and progress he had always championed. After the ceremony, as the community celebrated with music and food, the three stepped away a bit, observing the scene with a mixture of pride and reflection. "You know," Richard began, "when we were kids, I remember Dad taking us to construction sites, explaining how each building was more than concrete and steel. He said we were building the future." Helen nodded. "And you've done it. You've not only honored his legacy, but you've created something new, something greater." Michael smiled, thoughtful. "It's true. But I think the real legacy isn't in the buildings or even in this project. It's in the lives we've touched, in the opportunities we've created." He paused, looking at the happy crowd around them. "Look at all these people. Families who now have a safe home, children with a brighter future, elderly with dignity. That's what really matters." Richard put a hand on his brother's shoulder. "And it doesn't stop here. We have proposals for similar projects in other parts of the city. The model we created here can be replicated, expanded." Helen smiled, enthusiastic. "Imagine the impact we can have across Chicago, maybe even in other cities." Michael nodded, feeling a wave of determination and hope. "You're right. This is just the beginning." At that moment, observing the community they had helped build, Michael had an epiphany. His father's blue Nova, which had started this whole journey, wasn't just a symbol of the past. It was a reminder that sometimes you need to look back to find the way forward. "You know what?" said Michael, a gleam in his eyes. "I think it's time we restore that Nova one more time. But this time, let's transform it into something new. How about using it as a vehicle for community projects? We can take it to different neighborhoods, use it as a symbol of our urban revitalization mission." Richard and Helen smiled, excited about the idea. It was the perfect amalgamation of past and future, a bridge between John Smith's legacy and the new path they were treading. As the sun began to set, painting Chicago's sky with shades of orange and pink, the three remained there contemplating the neighborhood they had helped rebirth. The sound of laughter and music filled the air, a living testimony to the impact of their work. Michael took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment and purpose. They had faced enormous challenges, overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, and emerged not just as survivors, but as true agents of change. Smith Construction & Sons was no longer just a company. It was a force for urban and social transformation, a beacon of hope for communities across the city. And for Michael, Richard, and Helen, it was the realization of a shared dream, a legacy that would continue to grow and inspire for generations. As they walked back to join the celebrations, Michael knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. As a family, as a team, they would continue to build not just buildings but dreams, hopes, and a better future for all. John Smith's legacy lived on, not just in his name engraved on a plaque, but in the smiles of children playing on safe streets, in the grateful looks of elderly people who finally had a dignified home, and in the renewed determination of his sons and Helen to continue making a difference. And so, as night fell over Chicago, a new era was dawning for Smith Construction & Sons, and for all those whose lives it touched. The future was bright, full of possibilities, and they were ready to build it, brick by brick, dream by dream.